Go ahead. Did you have more?
Well, I was just going to give you some more kudos for
Oh,
our friend Leif Erikson celebrates sometimes mournfully some historical. I was going to say antecedent, but I don't think that's the right word.
just people and events and things. Yeah. And I have found myself, as you all have noticed, as Mick has put it, kind of digging information about underappreciated, not as well known as they should be, people, events, and things, or known in a skewed way, such as part two of this leaflet, John Brown. And this is going to be a leaflet in kind of the truest historical sense of the word, because it comes from the heart, and it's about I'm persuading here. I'm just going to go ahead and put it out there. I have become radicalized even more than I already was about human rights by reading about John Brown, by reading about all these people I've read about. But I got that book that I talked about last week, John Brown, Abolitionist. I got it last Thursday, and I've tried to read it all before the show, but I didn't quite make it. But man, oh man, today we're not going to get into the bloody stuff. So if you're looking for salacious details about the raids, you're going to have to go Google it for yourself. It's all out there, all the mistakes, all the blood, all the bad decisions, all the good decisions. It's there. So when we left off, we had talked a lot about Brown and ideas about him and stuff like that. And I wanted to get into, I even talked about playing a game, but as I've gotten closer to this, it just feels wrong to make light of any of it or play games about it. There's a lot of heavy stuff here, okay? And some of my worldviews and ideas are naturally going to come out in this. So understand it's my opinion, and I welcome other opinions, and am forthright that that's what it is. As I was preparing for this, I was thinking of when I was in sixth grade. I was a religious little fellow, as you might have heard me mention. I'm not now. John Brown very much was, so it's relevant to the discussion. But I was a religious little fellow in middle school, and I remember one time in sixth grade, the teacher said we needed to stop raining for something or start raining. I forget which. And so she's like, we're going to pray. So we stopped. The whole class is a Baptist school. The whole class stopped, prayed for the rain situation fervently to God, and then we went on with class. Well, a little later in the lecture, she was like, Eric, that's what I was known by then. Eric, what are you doing? Looking out the window. I got in trouble she thought I was daydreaming. And I was like, I'm waiting for the rain to stop. And she just told everybody that story. She told everybody in the cafeteria about how cute it was, that I was that sure, that much faith that the rain was going to stop. And I was befuddled at the time. I was baffled. Like, what is cute about this? We said the prayer, you quoted a scripture to us about, ask and you shall receive, the prayers of a righteous man availeth much. Here we are. And I thought that was the thing. We're doing this, right? Are we not doing this? Say, why is it cute that I'm doing the thing we said we were doing? I'm waiting for it to happen, right? And I noticed that a lot among humans is that we say we're in things. We're in it. But then when it comes time, we don't really act like we're in it. We kind of half-ass it. We go, well, I'm into that. But then when the chips are down, when action is required, we go, well, I'm not that into it after all. Or we just don't take it that seriously, as seriously as our words say. John Brown actually believed in the Declaration of Independence, and he believed in the teachings of Jesus in the Bible. And those are two of the things that our country is founded upon, right? Allegedly. You can argue all day, but those are two documents that are listed as founding documents of this country. And they both explicitly say how you're supposed to treat other people. They don't hint at it. It's explicit in them. And John Brown believed those things. And while society was either not taking them seriously or dragging their feet or dithering, John Brown was like, let's do this. Are we doing it or are we not doing it? Do we believe what we say we believe, or do we not believe what we say we believe? Do we believe the bumper sticker mentality of America, the bumper sticker version of America, that we fight for justice and for the rights of all? Do we believe it or do we not believe it? What do our actions say? Think about this. How did racial justice become a, quote, liberal thing? Can you get more conservative than the Constitution and the Bible? I don't think so. And you start bringing in other holy texts. They're all very explicit about this.
You
Are
bring
we
up some
living it
valid points
or are we
always.
not living it? It can't get more conservative than that. John Brown was fundamentalist conservative. He was a Calvinist. He thought he had been chosen before the foundation of the earth to either succeed or fail, but either way, to be on this mission for the people of God that he considered every human being. He was so conservative and so fundamentalist, but to him, when the documents say everyone gets treated equally and fairly and with justice, then everyone gets treated equally and fairly and with justice. He had his girls and boys doing each other's chores around the house. They buzzed happily as a unit, doing each other's chores. Boys doing girls' chores, girls doing boys' chores. Frederick Douglass, when he visited, was astounded and uncomfortable by it, by the way, that these roles were so interchanged there. He just believed literally that everyone was God's creation and that we had all been given rights our rights had been acknowledged by the Constitution. He modeled himself after the Old Testament patriarchs. Explicitly, he did. He believed he was a patriarch. And if you know anything about the Old Testament patriarchs like Abraham, they always set out on a journey that wasn't very popular. They had huge odds against them, but they led people out of slavery, out of captivity. They were savior types, and he considered himself that because he believed that everyone had a calling, and he believed his calling from the foundation of the earth was to fight for the right no matter what. Economy, politics, politeness, cooperation, all be damned. If they wouldn't do it, he would. That was his view of everything. This is what confuses me. I told you this is going to be a leaflet about Christians who support certain politicians who seem to embody the exact opposite teachings of Jesus and the Bible. But they argue that because of expediency and political policy, that it's okay to put those things on hold. Not the patriarchs, though. Notice, go to the Old Testament. They went and said to the face of power, you're wrong. Strike me down if you have to. Make all the bad policies in the world. But you're wrong, and I'm here to tell you you're wrong to your face. And that was what John Brown considered himself. And that's what he was doing leading up to 1855 when he traveled to Kansas to be with his sons. Now, Kansas is the first place where he got into some trouble with violence. It's like I say, you can look it up, Ottawatomie, Kansas. The reason he was in Kansas is because he had been planning, actually, the Harper Ferry raid, which eventually got him executed, that's later on. But he had been planning and wanting to do that for years. And sometimes he had put it off because the slaves he was trying to free, he valued their input. And he would have them vote and survey the people. He said, if we claim to be helping and serving these people, let's help and serve them. Let's listen to them. So he put off Harper's Ferry at least once because of the African Americans he was working with who asked him to put it off for various reasons. But he had been planning Harper's Ferry for a long time. And he sent his sons and his wife off to Kansas, and the daughter, I believe, off to Kansas because, if you know your history, maybe you don't. This is why it's exciting, right? You get to learn. Kansas was a new state, and there was a lot of talk about whether it was going to be slavery or pro-slavery or anti-slavery state. Abolitionists wanted to arrest slavery and scale it back until it was gone or just eliminate it, like John Brown. Pro-slavery forces wanted to make Kansas a slave state. They wanted to expand slavery. Anybody that tells you that slavery was going to go away on its own, look at the facts. It was being expanded. There's the Dred Scott decision, which ripped rights away from African-American slaves. There was the fugitive slave law in 1850, which said you must return fugitive slaves. There were all these laws being passed by pro-slavery forces. They were not phasing out slavery. This was coming to a head. And so Kansas was a battleground of pro and anti-slavery forces. And both sides were attempting to flood the state with people from their viewpoint so that they could have the state go slavery or anti-slavery. And John Brown sent his family there to establish an enclave for this purpose of having a presence there. And they were mistreated like crazy. Like people wouldn't sell to them if they found out they were abolitionists or even suspected they were abolitionists. They would meet people who had knives and guns and would just talk openly about their hatred of abolitionists and threaten all this violence. And one time a boat took off without the whole family because the captain was pro-slavery and he knew they were abolitionists. They paid their fare. They got off the boat to do something like everybody. They come back, the boat leaves early to strand them. These are the things that happened to them. So Brown, even though he wanted to stay where he was and work on Harper's Ferry stuff, he came back against the pro-slavery forces. He had tried to be a businessman and raise money for various ventures, but had always failed at it. And he was just, to him, capitalism wasn't that important. Money wasn't that important. He wanted to make money to establish schools and enclaves and fight slavery. So it was important to him. But at the same time, he kept putting his energies into the fight itself and just was not a money man. He had lots of debts and made a lot of bad money decisions, but he tried to make everything right with everybody. One thing everybody said about John Brown his entire life was that he was a man of integrity, who was a man of his word and believed in honesty and believed literally the Bible and following the rules of the Bible. Now, there's not a lot that, I mean, as far as supernatural belief, I believe the Bible is an amazing book, but there's not a lot that John Brown and I would have agreed on. I'm not an apologist for him as a person. We definitely agreed on human rights, though, to the point of, yeah, I feel that spirit of John Brown. I'm not ready to kill anybody. I'm not a violent person, but what I feel is that immediacy, that equal rights belong to everyone. That's not controversial. It's not radical. Think of a society in which that is radical. So that's the only way you can consider him radical until the violence, which we're going to talk more about, hopefully. For instance, he started a band of people called the Gileadites, who were abolitionists, and they after the passing of the fugitive slave law, they were instructed, if a slave hunter came for a slave, to strike them down violently. When he said, when the first of you strikes, everyone join in until he retreats, and in the distraction, you get the slave out of there. And they did this over and over. And from that time that he established the Gileadites, not a single slave was recaptured in Springfield, Massachusetts, because of this band of abolitionists who would strike out with violence if a slave, because the slave hunters would use violence. They would come and take you by force and hurt anyone who tried to stop them because they had the law on their side. This was legal. Remember, people are like, obey the law, don't break the law. Sometimes you got it. And he did. And that's the kind of stuff he was accomplishing. He couldn't make money, but he could organize people and inspire them. After he formed the group, like I said, not a single slave was recaptured. So meanwhile, he's got to go to Kansas now. Things were getting bad there, and of course that brings us to the inescapable subject of violence that hangs over all of this, which we have to talk about, right? It's not true that John Brown was a wild-eyed maniac who sparked war where there need not be any, by the way. That's a myth. And somebody said last week on our stream that maybe that just we in the North have been fed that lie. I mean, in the South have been fed that lie. The person, I forget who it was, said that in the South, John Brown is looked at a lot differently than I was brought up, which is a wild-eyed maniac, basically, who probably started a war where there didn't need to be one. And that's not true. There was strategy to his plans. He wasn't wild. He was violent, but he wasn't crazy. He was sober and sane and acting completely reasonably as he saw it. He and his wife, in fact, vehemently refused to adopt an insanity plea at the defense to keep him from at his trial to keep him from execution. They refused to. He said, "I'm not insane. I'm following the golden rule." Think about a society in which following the golden rule makes you on trial to be executed, and your only out is an insanity defense. Think about that for a second. This is the situation he was living in at the time. His life was at risk every day. And he said that the slaves who were held, this was long-lasting violence against these people. This was not non-violent. This idea that some people had that slavery was just sort of this established institution. Sometimes people were beat, but mostly it's just people trying to get work done. Owning someone as a human being is a violence against them. That's what John Brown said from the beginning. You start there. When you branch out, everything you do in that situation is a violent act. It's not the same as violence that he committed. That's why people debate about it. But he was not rising up against people as an insane man who were just doing their thing and living a way of life, and he wanted to destroy it. The pro-slavery side was violent, and they were determined to enforce slavery perpetually through violence. Sure, they might say, well, we want it to go away one day, but not when the economy's on the line. That's why they keep making the decision. You push it off and you push it off, and then they get desperate. And out of desperation, they started doing desperate things like all these violent laws and these really abusive laws that were designed to say, we are not going anywhere. Slavery is not going anywhere. And that's what John Brown was acting in the midst of. His entire point was that slavery, the abomination, would never end without violence. And the Civil War kind of proves that right. And here we are with, Race relations being what they are, part of the reason is we've never had an honest conversation about it. Every time there's been an advance, it's been through violence, either being perpetrated by people demanding their rights or being used against people who were peacefully demanding their rights. There's always been violence. It's always been struck down by violence and laws established by violence. And that's why we have the problems we have. It's like we've never come to terms with that. And John Brown was like, yeah, this is where we are. He was also desperate, by the way. They were desperate to keep slavery. He was desperate to end the horrors of slavery and to restore Black people to full equality and autonomy, and women, by the way, as outlined in his Constitution. He often spoke of his desire for a nonviolent resolution to the issue of slavery, believe it or not, but he felt that it was simply not possible. Now, here's a question to consider, folks. Here's the leaflet. Let's say your mother, your sister, your loved one, your friend is being held against their will. Someone comes and spirits them away to do whatever they want with them. Maybe you'll try negotiation and compromise for a while anyway. I mean, I don't know, if your mother was being held by someone against her will and being forced to do whatever they said, good or bad, would you just say, let me see if I can enact a law 20 years from now to bring this person home? Or would you say, we have to do whatever it takes to get my mother home? I think you know the answer to that. It's a legitimate question. What if your mother's captors were openly hostile against your entire endeavor and wishes and were quick to turn to violence to defend their imprisonment? These are not abstract numbers. These are people. What did Jesus say? When you do to the least of these, you do to me. Buddhism says you are your mother. You are the one being held captive. You're the captor, for that matter. This gives you a lot to think about. Like, this divide as if these are abstract numbers and abstract people, and that John Brown rose up in this abstract system and made a splash with his violence and naughty, not a true picture of the way things are. During his trial, he calmly asserted he was following the Golden Rule, along with the Declaration of Independence. He was doing to the least of these, in this case, meaning those who have no power to defend themselves. He wanted to give them that power, and he wanted, with the help of an assistance of abolitionists, he wanted them to seize that power and be free. At what point do you resort to violence to free, mistreated, and captive people? Let that question.
Big question.
It is. And I've come up with a little flow chart here of dealing with this question. Number one, okay, if you categorically disagree with violence to rescue falsely imprisoned people, let's say that's you. You're like, I categorically disagree with violence to rescue falsely imprisoned people no matter what. Then A, you are a pacifist, which is a legitimate viewpoint. I try to be a pacifist. I can't personally because of the defenseless and the innocent. But I would love to be. I think it's great. I respect pacifists. I'm not sure it's maintainable in the world, but I respect the effort. B, if you believe that other means will suffice, in which case, get busy, right? If other means are going to free the people, then let's get it going. And let's not take long about it because there are people, your mother is captive. Or C, you just don't care about the matter that much. I think those are the options. Either you're a pacifist, so you'll never use violence under any circumstances, or you believe the other means will work, in which case, let's go, someone's captive, or C, you just don't care. Those are the only options, I think. And John Brown said violence is the answer because he's not a pacifist. Other means weren't working and were violently being suppressed. And so he did what he did. So everyone except true pacifists recognizes that there exists a line where violence is needed in our world from time to time, specifically to protect the defenseless and the innocent. The only question remains is when that point comes and how it should be handled. Where you place those energies and what kind of violence you ultimately condone or justify reveals something about your values. For instance, Brown believed that the colonists were justified in their violence against the crown for the Revolutionary War, and he also believed this situation was no different. I know people who think violence from the Revolutionary War was fine, but violence now to stop Black people from being killed indiscriminately and needlessly by cops is not okay. But where do you draw that line? It's a sticky question, I admit, but he believed, John Brown was said to admire George Washington and Nat Turner equally. And if you don't know who Nat Turner is, Google that one. He admired them both equally. So that's the hard question before us today. When is violence justified and what counts as a last resort? Brown thought that we as people were there. We as a people were at that point, and that was hard to dispute. He says there were not fine people on both sides. There were people on one side that wanted slavery to continue violently, and when the other side had, he said, you were cowards if you didn't respond and knock that down. You know, by the way, the South, the pro-slavery South had written slavery into their new Constitution explicitly and immutably into the Constitution. Compare that to John Brown's proposed Constitution, which says slavery is none other than a most barbarous, unprovoked, and unjustifiable war of one portion of its citizens upon another portion, the only conditions of which are perpetual imprisonment and hopeless servitude or absolute extermination in utter disregard and violation of those eternal and self-evident truths set forth in our Declaration of Independence. Now, that was a deliberate no to slavery, as opposed to the South. People say, oh, they were going to get rid of it eventually. No, they wrote it into their Constitution immutably. So slavery would not have been legislated away in due time. And if it was, it would have been a long time off. And your mother, meanwhile, is captive. Look at the fugitive state law and the Dred Scott decision, which stripped away rights of citizenship to every African-American slave, and the push to expand slavery into new states. George Orwell once wrote in his essay on Gandhi, which I recommend, talking about pacifism, in essence, proving that that even pacifism begets violence. He said, if you are not prepared to take life, you must often be prepared for lives to be lost in some other way when you're going to stomp out evil. He said, that nonviolent resistance doesn't always work when you're dealing with lunatics and people who are willing to just kill you without looking you in the eye. The South have become more and more lunatic. That can happen with people. Call them out baldly for being wrong and horrid, and if they simply cannot see a way to not be horrid, what do they have left but to double down? So you end up treating people like they treated Brown and his family when they found out they're abolitionists. There's not much, like I said, that I would agree with him about, but to me, his inner beliefs were not nearly as important as his actions. I don't believe Calvinism and predestination like he did, but I think some people got it twisted these days. They think what you believe on the inside is more important than how you act. That's why the modern bigot has learned to use language that isn't explicitly bigoted. Either they're self-deceived and thinking they're not a bigot if they don't use certain language, or they just know they have to dial it back to fit in and get their message out. But they've learned not to use the language, but their actions reveal where their values are. Their energies reveal where their values are. So I just wanted to, I led up to the attacks. You can go read about them. I mean, I just can't get into it all, but actions are where it's at. His actions weren't lunatic, as some have suggested. You look up the Maroons sometime. These were enclaves in different countries, including the United States. The story is really fascinating, of escaped slaves who would go into like the mountains and live, in enclaves and fend off attackers. And so John Brown in these attacks was using the strategies of the Maroons and guerrilla warfare and mountain fighting. He said with 20 men, you could stave off 300 men up in a mountain in caves and stuff. Look, in Afghanistan, he's been proven right since then. Like, you can do mountain guerrilla warfare and stave off an army. His plans were not lunatic. And when he was caught and went up for execution, he considered it the will of God and said, well, this is the way it is, but I did what I had to do because I believe in the golden rule and the Constitution. And there we are. John Brown, part two, an impassioned Leif.
That's Leif Erikson with this week's Leif-let about John Brown and so much more. Leif, I feel that it's extremely pandering to say Leif Erikson for president, because I know that you would not want to be president.
No. Thank you, but no. I'm flattered, but no.
This is Trivial Thursdays on WRFL.